Tonight on The ReidOut.
The person said, hey, you've just indicted two major allies of the president, Chris Collins, a Republican congressman from upstate New York, and Michael Cohen, the president's lawyer and fixer. And it's time to even things out by indicting a Democrat before the midterms.
The bombshell new allegations from former U.S. Attorney Geoffrey Berman that Trump and William Barr wanted him to put his thumb on the scales of justice and go after Trump's political rivals. Also tonight, we have come to know Lindsey Graham as the most cravenly opportunistic politician in America. And that is saying a lot with Marco Rubio out there. And now, just 2 months after saying that states should decide on abortion, he is pushing for a federal ban. And Giuliani biographer Andrew Kurtzman joins me on Rudy's disgraceful descent. He was once called America's mayor, and now he's pretty much just a MAGA laughingstock. We begin tonight with new details on how Donald Trump ran his Department of Justice, which is exactly how he saw the governmental agency, as his. It's actually run by the U.S. Attorney General, but when said Attorney General is one William Barr, well, things get a little murky, don't they? Which brings us to Geoffrey Berman, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, who Trump fired in 2020 after he refused Barr's request that he resign. A lot has happened since 2020, a lot. But you may recall, Berman's firing was a big deal. We're talking about an American president strong-arming a U.S. Attorney General to fire a prosecutor because he refused to obey and to twist his office for the president's political purposes, and therefore had to be snuffed out and replaced with a lackey who would. Let's just say we weren't the only ones likening the U.S. to a banana republic that day. Berman has a new book, Holding the Line. It is out today. And in it, he details his ouster, along with damning allegations that Trump sought to use the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan as his own private law firm. One of the ways Berman alleges that the Trump Justice Department did that was to try to initiate criminal investigations or block them, depending on how Trump would benefit. The book describes how Barr suggested that the conviction of Michael Cohen, Trump's attorney, former attorney, be reversed, and that the DOJ pressured Berman's office to prosecute two Trump targets, former Secretary of State John Kerry and Greg Craig, a White House counsel under President Barack Obama. Craig is one of Washington's most powerful Democratic lawyers, and Trump wanted him to go down. Remember, nothing is more triggering for Trump than someone or something that's attached to the name Obama. And so the pressure to prosecute Craig came in September of 2018, 2 months before the November midterms, when a department official called Berman's deputy. Earlier today, Berman told my friend and colleague, the great Nicole Wallace, what the official said.
We want you to indict Greg Craig before the midterm elections. The person said, hey, you've just indicted two major allies of the president, Chris Collins, a Republican congressman from upstate New York, and Michael Cohen, the president's lawyer and fixer. And it's time to even things out by indicting a Democrat before the midterms.
Berman's office refused to even things out and said that they believed Craig was innocent. It should have ended there, but instead, the DOJ sent the investigation to federal prosecutors in Washington, where Craig was indicted and tried on a single count of making false statements. He was immediately acquitted by a jury because, as Berman's office tried to tell Barr, he was innocent. The Senate Judiciary Committee will now investigate these allegations, which adds another probe into the crowded genre of Trump controversies. Last night, we learned that the current Justice Department has issued 40 subpoenas in a week, expanding its January 6th inquiry. It also seized the phones of two Trump advisors. The January 6th committee is also signaling that another hearing could occur later this month. What these ongoing, overlapping investigations reveal could and should impact how America chooses its leaders in November, as well as this very day, as the primary season comes to a close tonight, with elections in New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Delaware. One of the Republicans running for his party's Senate nod in New Hampshire is Don Bolduc, a Trumpy, MAGA-happy advocate for the big lie who is leading in the polls. Even though Trump himself isn't on any ballot, his followers are. And until that pivotal day in November, the probes into January 6th and how Trump ran his DOJ will be impossible to ignore, raising the stakes of an election that could cost us, well, everything. Joining me now is former U.S. Senator from Alabama, Doug Jones, who is a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and Stuart Stevens, senior advisor for the Lincoln Project. Thank you both for being here. And Senator Jones, I still call you Senator Jones. You were a prosecutor, so you understand that the prime directive, obviously, is to do justice without fear or favor. What do you make of these allegations from Mr. Berman that essentially William Barr was using the DOJ as Trump's attack dog?
Well, I think Donald Trump was using the DOJ through the Attorney General. That should come as no surprise. I mean, remember, Joy, that Jeff Sessions was forced out as Attorney General because he did the right thing by recusing himself in the Mueller investigation, and Donald Trump never led him over that. He always was after him. So from the very beginning of the Trump administration, the DOJ was seen by the White House as Donald Trump's lawyer, doing Donald Trump's bidding, attacking his enemies, supporting his friends. It really comes to no surprise. But I will tell you, for those of us on both sides of the aisle who have been involved with DOJ for many, many years, it was really a sad state of affairs. It's still sad to even read about it, to hear about it, because that is not the way. Justice Jackson one time said, all U.S. attorneys should always make sure that they don't do anything that is politically motivated. They don't have the appearance. DOJ doesn't investigate people.
Right.
They investigate crimes.
Let me just, because you're absolutely right. Donald Trump is giving the orders. Barr is just following them. But I just want you to listen to what Mr. Berman had to say about Barr himself when he was almost in Cold. Take a look.
I think we should examine whether they followed their oath prior to the election. That's the inquiry that's important to me. And prior to the election, Barr did the bidding of the president, and he politicized the Department of Justice. And Barr couldn't have done what he did without the help of others in the Department of Justice. Bill Barr should have been standing in front of those magnificent doors of the Department of Justice, stopping political interference from entering. And instead, he was the chief architect of that interference.
I mean, yes, Trump is calling the shots, but Barr was dancing to the tune. And you were considered at one point for Attorney General. I highly doubt that you, I mean, all of your history, your work as a civil rights lawyer, et cetera, that you would have taken an order from any president to do what Barr did.
Absolutely
so Barr
not.
Do you think that William Barr is corrupt?
Oh, I'm not going to go with corrupt. I just think that there was a situation where he was in a position where he was being, Donald Trump was pushing everybody in his administration to do his bidding. I don't think Bill Barr did that. You know, I voted to confirm Bill Barr. And I have also ultimately said it was one of 2 or 3 that if I could take back, I would, because it was pretty clear very soon afterwards that he was not going to represent the department. He was not going to be that independent voice that I thought would instill the integrity, but he would be doing the bidding. It was improper at the time. And as I think Mr. Berman said, what happened before the election is a completely different than what we see with Bill Barr afterwards, who was on his way out the door.
Stuart, let me bring you in here, because the thing is that, there is this thing that Donald Trump does. He either finds people who are corruptible or he corrupts them. And it's hard to understand which it is. With Barr, though, he wrote a memo applying for the job, essentially saying, please, sir, put me in, coach. I'll save you from the Mueller probe. Outlined how he would do it in a memo. Got the job and came in and acted as the attack dog for the president of the United States, something Richard Nixon really wanted in his attorney general. It's the only other president who seemed to openly want that. Barr is now out on a rehabilitation tour, reputation renovation tour all over the place, and he went against Donald Trump trying to overthrow the election. So what do you make of his level of corruption or not?
Well, first, let me give a shout out to Senator Jones. I'm a Senator Jones fanboy, and I hope next time there's an open primary for the Democratic nomination for president, he'll run. I'm dead serious. He would be a fantastic president. Look, I think Bill Barr is in a plea bargain with history now. He's trying to rewrite his position. I mean, look, I think with all these Trump people, there's a fundamental question, and that is, had Trump had won, or had they been successful in the coup early on, would they still be working for Trump? And there's every reason to believe that Bill Barr would still be there. And, you know, it's part of this complete moral collapse of the Republican Party. And what Trump has done is he's attacked the institutions of civil society, law enforcement, judiciary, the elections themselves. And as part of that, he finds people who are corruptible. You can argue whether or not they're, I don't know where the difference is between being corrupt and acting like you're corrupt. And it completely destroys faith in the institutions, which is what is his goal. That is what authoritarians want to do, that you don't believe in the system anymore, so you have to go to this strong man or strong woman, and that's the way that they will save you. And that's just an extraordinarily un-American movement. It's because we are about these institutions. That is what makes us different and makes us the world's longest acting democracy.